All right, so let's continue on. Now we're going to go on and talk about the war itself. So, again, when we talk about World War one of the most important parts of the war itself is to understand it's what we call a two-front war. And we call it a two-front war because we have the Central Powers, and you're going to have the Western Front and the Eastern Front. So when we talk about the Western Front, that's the one I really want to start with, is you'll see primarily it's Germany moving into areas, trying to move into areas of France and England and so forth. Now, they're not going to get all the way to England, but the first goal is going to be to get into France. So the way this begins is the Germans had a plan, something called the Schlieffen Plan. Here's the map showing you the Schlieffen Plan. And the idea of this is to try to move from the north through Belgium down into France. And the thought was in the Schlieffen Plan that you go westward, hit the west hard really fast, break the west, and then afterwards, then you can focus on the east and Russia, because Russia was big, but Russia was not as strong army as compared to maybe the French were at the time. And so let's break the French and then we'll worry about the Eastern Front. All right, so you have the Schlieffen Plan. Now, what ends up happening is the Germans, in fact, move down from the north into Belgium. They get through Belgium quickly. They get into France pretty quickly, and then they get into France. And this all starts again by roughly August. By September of 1914, that a river called the Marne River, as you saw in that map there, about 20 miles away from Paris. And they're thinking they're doing well, everything's good, but then the nightmare unfolds. And that nightmare was that the British and the French were able to mount enough of a resistance about 20 miles away from Paris to stop the Germans from moving any further. The problem is they didn't have enough forces to push the Germans back out. And then what you get is stalemate. And in the Western Front, the stalemate is seen in one of the most horrific moments in Western civilization history, the story of trench warfare. So I want to spend a few minutes here talking about the trenches, talking about trench warfare, talking about what happens in these trenches that was so powerful and then so important to the entire history of this period. There's a really good movie that just came out in 1917. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. It's pretty brutal, but it really gives you a good feel of what it was like in those trenches during the war. And so that's a good something recent to see if you'd like. So anyways, let's start with one image I want to start with, which is an aerial view of the trenches. So just take a look at this image. Okay. And now that you've kind of seen that aerial view of the trenches, I'm going to talk about that first, and then from there, we'll give you some more images as well. So in terms of that aerial view, what you saw is you have two trenches, two sides of trenches. These trenches, let me describe to you, are dug in about 5-6 feet deep. You take that dirt that you dig in, you put on top. They're about 5 feet wide, 5-6 feet wide, and they would go on. Some of them would go on for hundreds of yards, some would go on for hundreds of yards, miles even. And you saw in that image, there were back trenches, side trenches, all of these kind of very complex views of the trenches you saw from the aerial view. And so if you think about it, you dig 5 feet, then you pile the dirt 5 feet up. So from where you're standing all the way to the top, it's about 12 feet high, right? And so you're living in these trenches. They also came up with new weapons of fighting. One of the most important impacts of World War I is the new devices that were used that came out of the war and fighting. So for example, barbed wire is something new, that you'd have barbed wire on the top of all the trenches that were going to create horrific impacts on people. And so you're living in these trenches and you see these two sides, and you have to do if you want to make any progress, you have to go from one trench to another trench. And in the middle, that whole area you saw with no trenches, that's of course that infamous piece of real estate known as no man's land. Some other new elements of warfare that were also part of World War I. The machine gun that is going to be heavily used during the war. You're going to have flamethrowers used during World War I. You're going to have high-power artillery shells that are going to be used during World War I. And of course, most well known is poison gas, chemical warfare, mustard, chlorine gas, this greenish colored gas that's going to, again, make horrible situations for so many people during the war. So let's say you get to this moment, you're in these trenches, and you need to make progress. You need to go from trench 1 to trench 2. And so you're given the orders to cross no man's land and to try to go into the other side trench. Now, you get up, you start crossing no man's land. If you are lucky, some high power artillery shells just blows you up in the middle of no man's land. Because there's always the possibility you get your way all the way through no man's land. And I want you to try to visualize this. Let's say you're a British soldier, you're trying to cross no man's land, and you're starting to get closer to that German trench. Remember, the way I described the trench is there's nowhere for you to go or run or hide. You're stuck in that trench, right? And so you're trying to run through no man's land, you get close, and let's say I'm 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet away from that German trench. If I'm a German soldier and I see somebody coming at me with a rifle and he's 5 feet away from me, I don't care about the hundreds of people in no man's land behind me anymore. I care about the guy with a rifle who's about to shoot me down. So I take my machine gun and I aim it dead set right at the person coming at me. And the barrage of bullets that comes out of the machine gun as the soldiers running towards those trenches, and they get right next to each other, the barrage comes at an angle, and the soldiers standing like this about to shoot down, the bullets come with such force that they often hit around the torso, right? With such force that they at times literally sliced the body in half, where the head, the arms would get caught in that barbed wire and the rest of your waist down would fall to the ground. So that's what's now happening to people in these trenches during World War I, right? It's this horrible brutality. And then there's living in the trenches. You're living in mud sometimes. You're living with rats the size of cats in these trenches. You might live in these trenches for weeks or months before you're even relieved of duty. There's nowhere to hide. It's just got to be this horrible, horrible life experience that these individuals went through. Again, I'm going to show you some pictures here in a moment that really illustrate, the horrible of the lives living in these trenches. It was something that they've never expected. And this goes on for a long time. Remember, this war started in 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917. They're still fighting these trenches. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. Before all is said and done, 9 million people will die fighting World War I, and millions of others will be wounded and blinded, and it's this horrible situation. So let me show you some more pictures of what life was like in the trench. So I'm just going to pop up a few pictures here, and just so you can see what they're like. All right, here we go. Let's just pop up a whole bunch of images here of the trenches. Okay, and so I just kind of want you to look through all of these. And so the first image you see here is of people trying to maybe going from one trench to another. You'll see images of the machine guns. Okay, so maybe you see an image there of a machine gun coming in that the Germans would use. You would see images of I think the next image here should be of the gas clouds. And then another image here is of the gas masks that they wore. And you see they weren't very good. I have this really spectacular image of an actual trench. And when you look at this image of an actual trench here, one of the things I want you to see is, how narrow the trenches are. You see where the food is, where the boxes are, where they held their food. And these are British soldiers. And if you look at this very carefully, you'll see that the man's hands are like really dark, super dark black hands. And even though it's a British soldier, he should be white. Why does it look so black and so dark? Well, because he's so dirty in these trenches, right? And so this is what it's like living in these trenches. And so if you remember, we had this image I showed you earlier of them just going off to war, and the image of the women and the men off to war. That was the image before. Now I want to show you the image after, the image that people perceive, and it is this powerful image of an artist named Otto Dix. And you look at this, it's horrifying, right? It's this horrifying image of a man grasping his chest, just in absolute pain, and this is Otto Dix's version of trench warfare. Okay, so you see the images. I described trench warfare to you, but there's really only one way to understand it. And the only way to understand it really is to hear the words of somebody who was there. And so there was a British poet by the name of Wilfred Owen, okay? So Wilfred Owen was about 18 years old when World War I broke out. 18, 19 years old, he got called up to the war, but he was a gifted poet. And he saw what the trench warfare did to people, and it inspired him to write one of the most famous poems in all of war history. The poem's title is called Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. The title is Latin, obviously. It translates to die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. That's the title. To die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. I want you to hear the words of this poem, right? And remember that title as well. To die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. So this is how the poem goes. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, but many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the wide eyes withering in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vial, incurable sores are on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell children adherent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce decorum est pro patria mori. The old lie, to die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. The most significant impact of World War I can really be seen in this poem. It is not just that 9 million people were killed in this war. It is that it shattered the soul of humanity. The optimism, the hope, the progress that existed before the war is shattered. Right? That idea is no longer there. Now there's despair, there's pain, there's suffering, there's anguish. And they never expected this war to go like this. And so this is going to resonate, and it resonates in many ways, because if you think of the period right after World War I, what this war does is kind of creates a vacuum of beliefs. It creates what we call that lost generation, where people don't have anything positive to grip onto. It's not a coincidence that in the 1920s and 30s, we see some of the most evil ideologies man has ever created before, right? Think about it. Fascism, communism, Nazism, they all grow very dramatically in the 20s and 30s, especially in Europe. In the United States, this is the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan. Why do you see these things? You see these things because, again, there's nothing positive, nothing hopeful for people, so they grip onto these horrible ideas when they were faced by the horrors of World War I. And that itself is still not the most significant impact of the war, because the real significant impact of this war and what you hear in this poem is really felt a generation later. Because a generation later, when Hitler was rising to power, the wounds of World War I were still so raw that when Hitler was doing these horrible things as he was coming to power, clearly something that people should have stood up to and said no. Many people in Europe said, well, we don't want to deal with Hitler, because they still remembered World War I. And they said, well, we'll just let him do what he wants to do and it won't be a big deal. And that's one of the darkest ironies of history, guys. World War I made no sense. It made no sense that Germany and England were fighting each other. There was no point to this war, really. The irony is World War II, a war where Europe should have got involved earlier, should have stood up to Hitler earlier to stop him. They didn't. And one of the major reasons they didn't is because World War I was so brutal, right? And that meant that when we get to World War II, not 9 million, but tens of millions, over 50 million people will be killed. And as we know, they will not just be killed. During World War II, we will see innocent people taken, innocent people tortured, innocent people gassed, innocent people experimented on like animals. And they didn't want to do anything about that, in part because of the brutality of World War I. So this is why the trenches matter. This is why this poem matters. This is why the brutality of World War I matters so much. So that's the trench warfare during the war, and that's what's going on in the Western Front. Okay. In the Eastern Front, we have a different situation. In the Eastern Front, it's very different because, frankly, Russia's getting its butt kicked, right? The Germans are moving in. If we look at our map here again, and we see on the Eastern Front, all these shaded areas there that you see on the map there, okay, all that shaded area, those are all areas Russia loses. There's some conflicts around Tannenberg, Galicia, Masurian Lakes. Russia's losing. Long story short, they lose tremendous amount of real estate, so much so that Russia's going to eventually have to bow out of this war. This was so devastating to Russia that it's not a coincidence. It wasn't one of the impacts of World War I. What's going to happen in Russia just as the war's coming to an end? The Bolshevik Revolution. The people in Russia are so upset with their government that it's going to lead to the whole rise of the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of communism, this horrible ideology that's going to cause so much pain to so many. As awful and as evil as we think of fascism and Nazism, historically, communism even murdered more people. And we'll do a whole lecture on the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution because it's so important. But for now, do understand that the Tsar of Russia at the time, Tsar Nicholas II, is going to lose power as a result of this war. There'll be other factors as well, of course, but the war devastated Russia. There is one other really important event in the eastern part of the war that I want to talk about, and it has to do with the Ottoman Empire. Because there's a group of people inside of the Ottoman Empire known as the Armenians. And the Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire before World War I, had wanted an independent state. Armenia is this region kind of between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. They wanted some independence, and the Ottoman Empire said no. Well, long story short, as we get into World War I, the Ottoman Empire decided they can deal with this Armenian problem of theirs in the most brutal way ever. The Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, committed a genocide, known as the Armenian Genocide, where they rounded up as many as probably about 1 million Armenian civilians. We don't know the exact numbers. Some numbers are about 500,000, some about 1.5 million, but probably at least about 1 million were rounded up and massacred. Women, children, the old, the young, didn't matter. These Armenians were Christian, of course, living inside the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim civilization. So part of this was religious, part of this was territorial. But at the end of the day, this genocide happened. What is really frightening about this is the leftovers of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, to this day still deny the Armenian genocide took place. They say some people were killed, there's some conflict, but they deny that there was a systematic genocide. The deniance of that, the saying that there was no Armenian genocide, is the equivalent of those who deny the Holocaust. We know what happened, we have the sources, we have the documentation. In fact, one of the things I'm going to give you to watch is a YouTube video specifically on World War I. It's called the Great War Series. I'll tell you what to watch on that, and you will see there's a little segment about the Armenian genocide. So you'll definitely want to watch that. You'll be taking some notes on that YouTube video as well. So that's definitely one of the most horrific impacts of World War I. So how does this war finally come to an end? We get into 1917, 1918. What finally brings an end to World War I? Well, what finally brings an end to World War I is what we will go on with in our next